So we'll start now. Our next panel deals with European security and the challenge of information warfare. And I would like to set two goals for this roundtable. First, I think we need to explain what is information warfare, how it is waged, how it fits in hybrid warfare, and why it really undermines European security, liberal democracy, and national cohesion. And the second objective for our roundtable is to compare various approaches to countering disinformation and enhancing awareness among the public in order to strengthen European security. So, but before that, let me first introduce our distinguished panelists. I start with Roberta Răducu, who kindly accepted to undertake a long trip from Bucharest, Romania, to take part in this European dialogue in Helsinki. Roberta is an assistant professor at the College of Communication and Public Relations within the National University of Political Studies and Public Administration. She's also a communication expert with the New Strategy Center in Bucharest, and her recent research interests include generational use of media and investigating disinformation narratives. I'd like to mention that you studied how Russian media outlets try to undermine Ukraine's integration perspective in the information space of two NATO members and two EU members, that is Romania and Bulgaria. And I think it's very interesting, and I hope you can share your thought about that. Minna Ålander is a research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. You are also a non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis and a senior fellow at the Stockholm Free World Forum. Previously, you worked at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, SWP, in Berlin. And your research focuses on German and Finnish security and defense policy, as well as on NATO and security in Northern Europe. And last but not least, Maxime Lebrun is the Deputy Director of the Research and Analysis Department at the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats in Helsinki. Prior to taking up this post, you worked at the Baltic Defense College in Tartu, Estonia, as a lecturer in war and conflict studies, and you recently published a study on how to anticipate and prevent cognitive intrusion. And I think this is also a very topical issue. So, with our panelists, we'll have two rounds of questions. The first round will characterize threats in the field of perception and information and their potential danger for European security. Then we'll have a second round of questions with the aim to explore the responses that have been elaborated at the national, European, and NATO levels to address the issue of disinformation. And then I'll take a question from the audience for an open discussion. And so if you want to ask questions, please, you can, while listening to them, you can prepare your questions. We really want this discussion to be as open as possible. So let me start with you, Roberta, if I may. Could you please explain the concept of disinformation and misinformation, and underline why these distorted narratives are dangerous. And we'll be happy to learn about some examples from Romania and the Balkans.
Thank you so much, first for your introduction, and second for this huge audience. I am quite surprised, and in a very good way, so thank you for being here today. I would start to describe what disinformation and misinformation is. They are strongly connected, but one is intentionally sending out messages to disinform your audience, and the other one is unknowingly sending those messages out. So disinformation is intentionally transmitting false information with the special intention to change one's behavior, to change one's beliefs or attitudes, or make one act in a way which was not initially what he intended, he or she. Misinformation, if I may, is an act of fear. We see something out there and we fear that information so much, we press the share button. And this way, we manage to disinform others, but without our intention being to disinform the other. But in a way, we think we do something good, that we inform others about something that we find dangerous, but instead we manage to disinform and to spread this like a disease. So misinformation is actually taking that disinformation and unknowingly spreading it out. Of course, we talked about responsibility earlier on. And I think this is something we all should be aware of, that we should be able first to check information and to see what seems to be disinformation and to hold back from sharing that in order to prevent ourselves to misinform others. Disinformation comes in a lot of models, so to say. It can be a satire or parody or of something that seems funny but somehow attacks our values. It can be a false connection. It can be a misleading content. And for this misleading content, I would like to tell you an example regarding something that happened inside of our country and was spreading so fast, it was spreading like fire. So there was a meeting between our president and the Ukrainian president. And after that meeting, they discussed about future plans of peace in our region. And one political actor in our country, which is known to be a far-right leader.
Close to Russia?
What?
Close to Russia?
Very close. But somehow he hides that publicly. But the narratives that he spreads are perfectly in line with what Russia says. So he made this huge public appearance saying that Romania made security promises to Ukraine. And in fact, he was called out on that by journalists. So thank you, journalists in Romania, for being very fast on catching on that. And he was confronted about it, and he said, no, this is what Romania did. We are going to go to war with Russia because we dragged ourselves. We don't care about the Romanian people, and we dragged ourselves into this war by making the security promises. And this had to be for, I think, two weeks span to be debated on what is security promise, what is actually what happened between the two presidents. They had to go over and over the information that they shared in that meeting. So other types of disinformation may be also false content. For example, during COVID time, there was a picture with our prime minister at that time drinking beer with other prime ministers, with other ministers. But that information was taken out of context. The picture was from 2018, but it had so many shares that a lot of people believed this all COVID thing was a big hoax. So you can imagine just how deeply it rooted the distrust we had towards our leaders, our political leaders. It can also be imposter content. It can be manipulated content, so taking things out of context, and also fabricated content, 100% false information that are sent out there to make you believe that. One example in this regards was around the beginning of the war in Ukraine, when they were stipulated that Romanian soldiers were sent out to fight in the Ukrainian war. Again, making people fear and sending this information out, making people fear that we are dragged into this war. One more thing about the narratives, and I promise I finish because I think I went way over my time. The narrative in itself is not a bad thing. We as human beings live on stories. This is what we like to consume. Everything that we do is a story. But when you change the way you use that story and you enter someone's subconscious and you manipulate its beliefs, then it becomes dangerous. And usually the disinformation, especially Russia uses, are these kind of stories that make you fear for your own life. So it's extremely contagious. People online don't necessarily share good experiences. We like others' good experiences, but we share the things we fear the most. So the favorite narratives usually sent out by Russia, and nowadays they even use a different method to send out these narratives. They use sponsored content. So we don't have just some small actors sharing out information. They have literally marketing agencies and PR agencies posting this sponsored content on the platforms that we trust to resolve these kind of things. And they spread this information with sponsored content, which is extremely scary. And their most favorite things to spread about is the electoral process, accusations of fraud, pre-marked ballots, canceling ballots, about the war in Ukraine, about the arms supplies, about the refugees, about the climate change, and how how everything related to the climate change are actually left-wing conspiracies. And yes, when we read the stories online, we first should think, is this story meant to make me fear something? This should be our first thought. Is this story making me fear something? And then process, but we're talking about this
Thank you,
later
Roberta.
on.
Thank you. The story you mentioned about the far-right politician reminded me that during the Cold War, the Soviet secret services would carry out what was called active measures, and they would spread fake news as well. And so they're accustomed to using subversion activities in order to manipulate MPs, journalists, politicians, or high-ranking civil servants who would unconsciously, and this is also, it refers to your point on misinformation, these persons would unconsciously act as agents of influence. And it seems to me that the development of internet allows to achieve similar results, but on a much larger scale. And so I now turn to Maxime. I'd like, Maxime, maybe first I'd like to ask you to explain to our audience how filter bubbles and echo chambers work on internet, and why selective exposure to polarized information can pose a real threat to democracy. And after that, I will have another question for you. Right away.
By all means, thank you. So indeed, filter bubbles and echo chamber, absolutely key issue. It kind of resonates, fine. I think the basic idea with filter bubble is that you get presented with something that you want to see, that matches your senses, that matches your expectations, that you will likely get engaged about. And people get usually engaged, as we've said in the previous panels, with controversial content, hateful content, something that generates some strong reaction. So that's kind of the filter bubble effect, that you get presented with something that you like, that you will be, that you will click, that you will get engaged about. And then that also connects with the phenomenon of the echo chamber, which is basically when people get to see what they like, only discuss with each other about something that they agree with, and the interaction that they have with the outside world or with those on the opposing sides of the argument is only conflictual, or is only deepening what we call affective polarization, seeing the other side as an enemy and seeing one side as almost as a family that needs to be defended at all costs. So that's kind of the interesting nexus between the filter bubble effect and the echo chamber effect, which is at the heart of what we can call affective polarization, almost cognitive polarization as well. So that's the first part of my answer.
Of your answer. Thank you. Thank you, Maxime. And now, could you tell us how we can distinguish between foreign malign interference and a legitimate attempt to influence, and why, in a sense, it is so important to pay attention on the actors of manipulation of disinformation?
Well, I will try to answer your point with 4 points. 2 points on how to distinguish between foreign interference and foreign influence, and then 2 points on why it is very tricky and almost slippery sometimes to distinguish between the two in actual practical responses. The first line to distinguish between foreign interference and foreign influence is about transparency. Most often, foreign influence is done rather covertly, rather transparently, but foreign interference is not done covertly. It is done with an active concealment effort as well. You link up with a journalist or you link up with an opinion leader, and you conceal that connection in order to put your message. So I would say that the first line is about transparency, the existence of active concealment measure to the effort of foreign interference. Because it is not, it is, for example, of course, embassies conduct policies of influence. That is perfectly acceptable to try to do some country branding, to try and influence the position of the residence country in a way that would somehow match the interests of the sending state. That is expectable, accepted. It is also regulated by a series of conventions, so it's perfectly within the norms of diplomacy, for example. But then, and that leads me to the second line to distinguish between foreign interference and foreign influence, is about the legitimacy of the intention. It is not very legitimate to disrupt electoral processes. It is not legitimate to pay influencers to create videos in order to polarize a side of the argument by non-disclosing the origins of the funds or the origins of the principle of the action. So the transparency and legitimacy of intention, that's key to distinguish. And those two are linked, of course. What is going to be legitimate is more likely to be transparent than not. So that's kind of I would say, the key distinction between those two. But then also it is very difficult, having said that, to distinguish between the two. Because, for example, the actors of interference and the actors of influence can sometimes be the same. A lot of Russian diplomats have been expelled from Europe since 2022, not because of bad diplomatic work, but because of potential links to authorities, to influencers, in a way to cover the interference attempts. because they can be liaison to those interference attempts. So you can have the same actors that do legitimate diplomatic job and that also act as liaison for interference attempts. But then also, and I think the main difficulty why, or the main reason why it is difficult to distinguish between the two, is that the domains that political interference actually triggers are extremely slippery: information and politics. How to draw the line between legitimate political speech and speech that would be favorable to a foreign power, but that foreign power does not have anything to do with the onset of it, or maybe he does. That's an extremely tricky thing. What if, for example, a political party's political agenda objectively matches with a hostile foreign power's foreign policy agenda? What do we do to it? I don't have an answer to it, of course, but that's to show you that it is extremely tricky. It is okay to kind of not agree with the line of a government, but when do we know that this disagreement is legitimate, meaning it's kind of organic, or is it kind of weaponized or leveraged? So those 4 points to show that it is possible to distinguish, but it's also tricky and slippery to distinguish the two.
Thank you. Minna, let me finish the first round with you, please. You are a NATO expert, and I'd like to dwell a little bit on hybrid warfare, and to ask you how information warfare fits in the hybrid maneuvers that NATO competitors and adversaries undertake to weaken the alliance or national cohesion. And could you also please illustrate your ideas with examples that are relevant to Finland?
Thank you very much for the excellent question. So the connection between information and hybrid warfare is a very close one. Basically, information warfare is part of hybrid warfare in a sense. So it can, of course, be part of also kinetic warfare, but it's always present in hybrid attacks, for example. So let's say that there is either an attempt or a successful sabotage of some public infrastructure. And there will always be connected to this sort of actual physical occurrence, the information dimension, which includes, for example, such things as what kind of reactions that attack creates, both in the media sphere, how do the officials react. So there are several levels to this. First of all, the adversary can gain a lot of information through this, about the state of preparedness in the country in question, and also the goal mostly of these hybrid attacks is to sow sort of uncertainty and fear in the targeted society. So in this information domain, the adversary therefore also gets a lot of useful information about how well it reached these goals and how resilient the society is and whether this strategy worked in the first place. So let's say, for example, so this can go sort of both ways. Sometimes it can be a disinformation campaign that actually leads to also some real-world events. So there was, for example, this massive disinformation campaign against Sweden in the past years, with the narrative that Swedish authorities would be taking away children from Muslim families. And by the way, this was for the first time utilized the same strategy against Finland more than 10 years ago, but with the twist that it would have been Finnish authorities taking away Russian children from their families. And this got so bad, and like in combination also then with the Quran burnings that happened in Sweden during the NATO accession process, that 2 Swedish tourists got killed, actually, got shot in Brussels while they were there, because of this anger that this disinformation campaign had caused towards Sweden, and also Swedish embassies got attacked in some countries. So this can go both ways. Or then, on the other hand, there can be something that happens, for example, that in Finland there was a series of attempted break-ins at water supply facilities. And nothing very bad happened, so there were no like disruptions in the services or something. But then, of course, like depending on how it is reported on and how people react to that, it can really make people feel very uncertain about like what's happening. So that's precisely what makes it so tricky to respond to hybrid attacks, because there is always this information dimension to it as well. And for example, in a case where something happens and the government officials or other authorities are addressing the issue, but without being able to present any kind of measures they are taking or any kind of solution to the problem, they may inadvertently end up sort of amplifying the information goals by the adversary if they appear weak and like sort of like helpless with the threat.
Thank you, Minna. That's a very good point, I think. So let's now move on to the second part of our discussion, but I hope you are preparing questions, especially students in the audience. We are waiting for them. I would like to ask you now what kind of answers, what kind of responses should be developed to counter disinformation and misinformation and malign influence, while preserving civil liberties and basic rights. And I think this is very important to remain true to ourselves. Maxime, maybe first, could you please explain why it's so important to raise awareness among the public and maybe to introduce some kind of regulation in the information sphere?
Well, thank you. That's really linked to what I said in the beginning as well, that foreign interference happened under the shadow of concealment, active concealment. Hidden structures and also illegitimate motives. That's something that needs to be uncovered. I've been quite struck by since it's a European dialogue, it's always good to speak about the Americans as well, about the FBI's recently published affidavit against two Russian nationals, Mr. Kalashnikov and Ms. Afanasyeva, who were two former Russia Today employees, or not former, actual current Russia Today employees, who have basically laundered about $10 million into creating a false flag media in Tennessee. As we said in the beginning, in another panel as well, the importance of fake local media. We've seen that. There was a fake local media in the state of Tennessee, which, with $10 million, produced about 16 million, hundreds of videos, which gathered about 16 million views on YouTube. And this effort worked through a very fascinating story of screen companies, money laundering, fake personas, weird contract with some local influencers who accepted to do some videos for this false flag media, which was actually a Russia Today enterprise directly funded by Russian public money. So the importance of concealment here, that speaks to that. And I think linked to that, one of the key measure or one of the key kind of political priorities that we should bear in mind is to uncover the complexity of this architecture. Because it's not just a disease that disinformation would spread or that information manipulation would spread. No, those are actual actors doing something with actual solid money, weird structures that need to be kind of brought to light in order to be brought to justice. Because that's also, the quality of our responses is also going to depend on how do we characterize those actions. Are there crimes? Are there offenses? How illegal is it to do this kind of action? And what are the facts behind those false flag media, for example? That's extremely fascinating. So I think we need to put resources, of course, in investigative services, and I'm not only talking about human or financial resources, but also legal resources. What do the investigative services actually research, investigate? Do they have jurisdiction? What kind of sanctions can they impose? So we have to do a lot of work about the legislative framework that would allow police services, law enforcement services, into doing something about those foreign interference attempts, which can be characterized in many ways. Now, on the topic of the regulation of the information sphere, that's also a critical one, because how one can see the information sphere nowadays is that it is a massive market for human attention, which is widely unregulated. And the social media platforms in it, we've criticized them in previous panels, but they are irresponsible by default. By design, they are third-party content providers, so therefore they are not responsible for the content that is on their website. That's part of the US legislation upon which they have developed, and the US case law. This has not yet been overturned. I encourage you to kind of try and look at those dry debates on the US district courts about several dissenting opinions on how should we treat the responsibility of the social media platform. Do they actually provide a message for which they should be responsible or not? That's a fascinating debate. And I think as long as the social media platforms are going to be irresponsible by design, by default, then we're going to just play a game of cat and mouse. The work of fact-checking, debunking, pre-bunking, and countering disinformation is fundamental, but it's never going to be enough. It's always going to be reactive. It's always going to be running behind the ball, in a way, as long as this field of human attention is not regulated. And that makes massive money, so it's a bit of a contradiction, or it's counterintuitive that this would not be adequately regulated. The first European steps in that direction are extremely good, and the ball is now in the enforcement court, in a way. But that's what I wanted to mention about this, because as long as we don't regulate this battlefield, really, then our democratic fabric is going to be extremely weak and vulnerable to all those kinds of attacks. So if we want to actually deal with it on a political level, on a strategic level, then that's on the field of regulation that we should kind of look at, and responsibility.
Thank you. We heard, thanks to Maxime, that a legislative effort is needed. We now understand that the military answer is underway, but it seems to me that education is also of crucial importance. Roberta, you believe in educational initiatives about pre-banking or debunking, about fact-checking services as well. Could you share your views on that bottom-up approach through media literacy to fight disinformation? Thank you.
Thank you as well. I would add up to what Maxime already said, that we need regulations for these platforms, and we indeed need to hold responsible the ones, not only the platforms, but also the ones who are publishing on these platforms. But in order to do that, we need regulations to who has access to publish on these platforms. So there's a circle. But going back to what we can do individually and from an educational point of view, I would like to split this responsibility in two parts. First, I'd say that the institutions that are most of the time under siege, under attack of disinformation narratives, should do the pre-bunking initiatives. This means they should invest more and more in strategic communication. This is indeed needed in these times in order to prevent disinformation to act upon them. This means the institutions need transparency and need to be true to themselves and inform the people what are their responsibilities, what they are doing, how they are acting, and so on and so forth, in order for people to have easier access to that information and to be able to fact-check themselves what's going on. The second part is that the debunking part is not only the media responsibility. A lot of times we see media and journalism doing this debunking and following stories that some politicians or institutions say, and they come back and repair that story. But it's also a responsibility of institutions and NGOs and think tanks that act on this, because only providing this kind of information to the public can get the education it needs to defend themselves. And last but not least, we as individuals should learn to check the information ourselves. Of course, there are educational, for example, in my university, we have special classes on mass media and society that teaches the students to do the fact check. Also, in the crisis communication classes that I teach myself, I also teach them that they need to fact check, they need to find the truth in the information and not let the emotion take over and act on the emotion, that they need to, you know, take a step back, calm down a little bit, and check the information from official sources. So we always communicate about what an official source is, how to do this fact check, how to act upon fact checking. But yes, it is an individual thing that we can do ourselves. First in schools, and second, there are a lot of materials even online. So last year I was part of a project called Dominoes. I was part of this NGO that I already told you about, New Strategy Center, but we worked with 2 other universities that are specialized in working with information. And we made a course that is even now available online, and you can check that information and how to do the pre-bunk and debunk yourselves. So there's a lot of materials out there that you can yourself check and learn how to do, how to become responsible with the information you consume. Thank you.
Thank you. Minna, I have a question for you. Finland is known for its comprehensive approach to security, an approach that aims to empower people and to make them feel responsible for their own security, but also for the security of the whole country. So I'd like to ask you if you could elaborate on the Finnish and maybe also on the Nordic and German approaches to these issues of foreign interference and malign influence. Do you think that there is a Finnish take, or yeah?
We'll need several hours if I go through all those countries, but maybe I'll limit myself to Finland and some other Nordic countries. I would like to actually, so the comprehensive security idea is that security is not only provided by the military or the armed forces, and it's not only about national defense, or that national defense takes place in more ways than just with the military, and that you need the whole of society on board to effectively do national defense. So if you look at the map of Finland, it's quite a large country in terms of territory, but we're only 5.5 million people. So that's a challenge in terms of how to actually cover the whole country in terms of territorial defense. So it starts there with this idea. And then with such a small population, the idea is that national defense is an effort for the whole society. And then there's also this whole of government approach, which means that of course, the authorities are the first ones most responsible for any kind of crisis response, and they work fairly well together in Finland, actually. So there's a lot of coordination efforts and contacts between different levels of authorities, both locally and nationally or nationwide in Finland. And I would say that one very important element that we have not addressed yet here, which I would add to this discussion about media literacy, is the citizens' trust in authorities. Because if there is no basic trust in authorities, then they will not trust information from official sources. And it almost gets this kind of ontological and etymological dimension of what can you know and how can you know it? Sort of from what sources can you trust? When you're confronted with this kind of, you're trying to debunk something, and then you're confronted with this, but how do you know? Or how do they know? And if there's no, if there is no agreement in the society on how you can know things and what are credible sources, then I wouldn't say that the battle is lost, but it's definitely not looking good. So this is incredibly important, and how you can sort of create that kind of trust in authorities is, of course, that the authorities act in a very responsible way, that people have the feeling that the authorities take their task seriously, that they do prepare for possible threats, and that they don't just like sort of stand there helplessly if something happens, but that they can actually take measures and so on. And all of this also comes down to sort of narratives were mentioned, and the people always look for narratives, and we live for narratives, and that's so important that you have some kind of a positive national narrative in the country, sort of like something. And this is not only relevant for if we talk more in military terms about the willingness to defend the country, but also in this like wider resilience building. It's very important that people have some kind of a positive narrative of their country, which makes them more likely to trust the authorities, and then also less likely to believe mis and disinformation because they know that like their authorities would not act in such a way. So, and this is of course no easy task, and it's like I can't sort of like say what this. There's no like universal recipe how to reach this, and it depends on each country. So, but I believe that in most of our like democratic Western and European countries, we have some good things that that makes like life nice for the citizens. So this is something that each country has to sort of harness for themselves. And in the Nordic countries, this sort of total defense or comprehensive security concept has proven to be the best one, given the demographic and geographic conditions. So also Norway and Sweden are very large countries with small populations, and then you sort of like need to make sure that you can reach citizens, for example, and that they are at least not hampering your efforts to deal with the crisis.
Thank you, Minna. So we'll now open the floor, please. Yeah, Monsieur.
Hello, I will make this easier. Maxime, Embassy of Ukraine. Look, I have 3 questions.
Oh no, only one. For the first
it's
round.
connected.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. First and foremost, do you recognize that we have a war in info domain? The second, if you recognize that we have a war in info domain, we need to replace the one word in the topic of this panel, Europe security in the face of information attacks. And the third one, the war could be won just with active defense. Are democratic nations ready for active defense in info domain? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question.
Hello, my name is Hossein Darakhshan. I'm the co-author of the Information Disorder Report by Council of Europe and the person in charge, responsible for the concept of malinformation. I'm sure some of you have seen it. My question is very empirical. Have you seen examples of disinformation applied to the past? Meaning historical documents, historical fabrications and stuff, given that it's much more difficult to debunk because many people are dead already, or you can't, triangulate, and forensic stuff is really difficult for that kind of stuff. Thank you.
Okay, who would like to start? Maxime, let's go. Yeah.
All right, thank you. So I will maybe start with the first 3-part question. Thank you very much. I think everything that we have discussed in this panel closely fits into the international environment where we have a war in Ukraine. Absolutely, there is a Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. We are definitely talking about informational threats as informational attacks. Yes, absolutely. The example that I mentioned about this false flag media in the Tennessee is directly linked to the war to the war against Ukraine. So absolutely, we are speaking exactly about what you mentioned, and we have definitely realized there is a war, to take the terms of your question. I may take the question about disinformation in the past, right? A lot of disinformation has to do with historical revisionism, not revisionism as the regular work of a historian, because doing history is about revising what we know, but on factual basis and finding new facts and building new knowledge. But historical revisionism to push a certain political agenda by manipulating historical facts, it's at the center of the Russian propaganda, the Chinese propaganda, the Iranian propaganda as well. So yes, absolutely, this is kind of inherent to the topic of disinformation.
Maybe Roberta, would you like to add some words about the difficulties to do debunking?
I would first like to appreciate also the first question about being in the informational war. I think somehow for a lot of authorities it is easier to just say the war is in Ukraine, and because there's also kinetic movement, but in fact our democracies are under siege, and I think we need to acknowledge that a little bit more in order to take action, in fact, against disinformation. Regarding the historical disinformation, I think in Romania and Bulgaria as well, but also in Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, there's been, at the beginning of the war, a lot of disinformation with these regards, because Russia was trying to attract somehow a little bit of, not appreciation is too much to say appreciation, but a kind of, it's okay what they're doing, they helped us before, we cannot be against them. The thing is, these countries don't forget easily, but it's also easy to, you know, just pinpoint the good deeds Russia did in the past and somehow move a little bit the attention of some population towards what they're doing and make them not act upon what they are hearing from here and now on. So yes, I think the historical disinformation is extremely dangerous and should be fact-checked immediately and you know, fight back instantly, because otherwise you lose a part of the population who does not care that much to fact-check. And about the hard part of doing disinformation, doing debunking, yes, it's extremely hard to do it because you receive messages from so many sources attacking things that literally baffle you from all points of view, and you don't know where to start. And when the debunking part or the pre-bunking part is done just by a small population, you cannot cover it all. So it's the disinformation is going to multiply much faster than you can debunk all of that information. And there's also something very special about the human minds. The narrative that we hear first, the version that we hear first, we tend to believe it more than what we hear after. And I think this should sit a little bit. This is food for thought.
Thank you. Minna?
I just have a recent example of disinformation, or like an attempt, not so much in Finland or against Finland, but Russia has been trying to sort of poke the issue of the Åland Islands recently in their domestic disinformation. And so in Finland, it's often not so much a problem that Russian disinformation works particularly well in Finland, but the problem is that it works well outside of Finland, because people tend not to know a whole lot about Finland, and then especially misinformation can spread much easier if people have no sort of like fact basis to assess whether this information is likely to be true or not. So this is actually more of sort of like an external problem in a way, but this was very interesting, like with the Åland situation, that Russia was trying to sort of like create this narrative that maybe Åland is actually more like, feels like more like part of Russia or something rather than part of Finland. And it was really funny actually, because Åland is completely Swedish speaking, and if it's part of any other country than Finland, then it's definitely Sweden, and Russia has no chance there. So this was a very poor attempt actually. I don't know whether it like gained any traction, but it was sort of funny.
Thank you.
I'm from Belgium. My question was about the sources that make people distrust media, mainstream media. The foundations of this distrust, what makes people say that there are fake media and stuff, not just Donald Trump, of course, but the whole, the whole movement around it, which is broader than just one man. How do you address this? And how do you ensure that people, for instance, on the right wing, which Mr. Răducu was mentioning, that they have a way of politically expressing themselves without going pro-Russia, for instance? And it comes to mind that, for instance, in the Bayern, the CSU, they were right-wing, but anti-Soviet Union or very critical. Poland, actually, today, if I'm correct, also have a strong right wing, but critical of Russia. So how do you integrate this without going pro-Russia or pro-Ukraine war? Yes.
Hi. The kinetic war was traditionally announced by artillery barrages, and now in the modern days, the next land grab or kinetic chapter of Russia's expansion is announced by information war and hybrid attacks, and we are fully underneath this assault and have been for a long time. The more I travel in Western Europe, the more Colonel Le Goff talked about winning the war before the war. Well, it feels like from the informational front, that war is being lost. We're in trouble. So what does it look like to mobilize all of Europe, 500 million people, to join the ranks and win this information war before they are forced to be conscripted, and we have to do it like the last two times everything was burning here?
Thank you. Minna, maybe would you like to start?
So the sources of distrust in mainstream media is, I think, was the first part of your question. Well, I think that here, we the people are the main problem. Many people have a way too high opinion of themselves and their ability to find information. I mean, there are all these memes about people who are I did the research and that's why I know it better than the mainstream media. And I think this is exactly the internet trap. I think some people are more likely to sort of that makes it so effective that when you have this kind of sort of alternative news sources, that they can really tap into that idea that for people that they want to feel like they're more clever than whatever they consider the mainstream, and they can offer this kind of feeling that here you can actually find the real information and not the lies from the mainstream media. So I think it's I'm not a psychologist, so I can't really explain those mechanisms and how that can be addressed. But I think that plays a lot into this. And I think that to an extent there is this conflict in open democracies, for example, with the regulation of social media platforms and then a certain kind of censorship, let's say, that if there is some very acute disinformation attack, let's say, and you might have to then apply some censorship measures, but that's not a long-term strategy, for example. And then all of this sort of comes back to the fact how can we make sure that people are able to distinguish how you can know things and how you cannot know things and from what sources and so on, and how you create this kind of your own palette of multiple sources so that you can compare information and then base your opinion on whether this is likely, and that you understand that if there's this one source saying a completely opposite thing, that's probably not the real truth behind it, sort of. So, and then about the sort of non-pro-Russian right-wing, it's the same in Finland. We don't really have a pro-Russian right or left-wing political party, so it's because we have such a sort of clear threat environment here. I think it's the same as in Poland, for example. How you achieve this in further Western Europe, where the threat environment is more diffuse, let's say, that's a different question, definitely. And I personally just find it interesting how the Soviet Union was really able to use a lot of the Western left-wing parties as sort of proxies, because there was an ideological affinity. And now it's more with the right-wing parties to an extent. So there is still that like Soviet nostalgia to an extent with the left-wing parties in some countries, but it's more about like this ideological affinity between the Putin regime and right-wing parties. And I think that it's always good to point out like, okay, if your ideology is closer to whatever the Kremlin offers, then what are you doing here in this like open democracy and like where we want to live free and so on? So I don't know, I think it's at least sometimes maybe useful to ask that question if people are very much along the same lines as the Kremlin.
Thank you.
Regarding how to have a right wing without being pro-Russian, well, first maybe start by not spreading the Russian narratives of disinformation. We actually have a right wing in Romania, which is not pro-Russian. It's actually European and pro-NATO. And they fight for that alongside with our left wing, which is absolutely crazy that we have a government made of these two wings. But what I was talking about, in fact, were the too far right. So they are beyond just trying, you know, to stay within Romanians and trying to give more to Romanians and less to the globalization, which they fear for weird reasons. Because without globalization, they would not be online and they would not have an audience and so on and so forth. So yes, we have media, which is in the right wing, but the problem is the moment you start to take pro-Russian narratives and spread it and contest your constitution and go beyond your constitution, and that's the moment it's too far right for me, personally.
Thank you. Maxime, would you like to add?
Yeah, I can add something
words?
very briefly,
Okay.
maybe on this right wing, but I would add far right wing or extreme right wing, because I think we shouldn't kind of consider the mainstream right or mainstream left as something to be done something with. But I think the essence of your question is about the fact that it's a matter of identity. The question of information is not that important, but I think that's also something that links to something that I've discussed in the beginning about the trickiness to distinguish between interference and influence, and when does a political discourse objectively matches to the agenda of a foreign power. We know that anti-minority, anti-LGBT discourses are objectively matching the Kremlin's propaganda, and in some countries it has produced effect on a foreign policy stance regarding Ukraine as well. So I would just add this slight word of caution that although the party itself may not be pro-Russian objectively or openly, the discourse can match objectively the foreign policy objective of the foreign power. That's a fact.
Thank you. Is there a last question? Yeah, Monsieur, and I will add a question.
Thank you. Martin Erikresin. One issue that was briefly addressed in the previous panel and also here, but not, I think, to the extent it should be, is the trustworthiness of the institutions. And in Finland, we've had numerous examples of that in recent times. For instance, during COVID, we had two government institutions, THL and STM, constantly giving mutually contradictory information about the situation and what needs to be done. And that somewhat undermines the trust and credibility of the state's institutions. We've also had multiple examples at every election, especially parliamentary elections, of party leaders very obviously having influenced the questions of the opinion polls of the main newspapers and main TV stations. We've even had a case where the candidate selection script of Helsingin Sanomat very obviously received specific, I would not quite say orders, but very insistent messages from some parliament members about what questions they want to see. And the editor-in-chief replying that, no, they did not influence, they did not dictate the questions, they merely showed concerns. And that also, I think, undermined the credibility and trustworthy of the media.
What is the question?
Right,
Yeah.
I'm getting to that.
Yeah.
So my question is, and it's kind of a military perspective on things, soldiers are sworn in to defend the nation. How do you defend the nation against your own institutions, against your own politicians, and against your own mainstream media?
Well, that's quite a question to be.
What's your name and affiliation again?
Martin Erik Rasin, no affiliation whatsoever. But you might know me on Twitter as Perkelix.
Thank you. I want to add a question for all of you. I would like to ask you what is, in your opinion, the most dangerous fake you encountered? And it seems to me, and I would like to come back also to the danger of artificial intelligence, because, I mean, now we have deepfakes imitating familiar voices, even mimics. These deepfakes will make false speeches look real. And it is already possible to create a fake that makes a politician say anything. And I think given the international tensions, given the challenges to democracy, it could have, really devastating consequences. So it's, I would like to have your view on the most, the most challenging fakes, or the most. Thank you.
I actually have some good examples on this. I just wanted to just briefly address the question. The pandemic was an incredibly difficult time for authorities because it was a completely new situation. There was a lot of new information coming in all the time. It was definitely a test for how well government coordination works. No country did it perfectly. I think Finland fared fairly well. And I don't know, to be honest, I don't know what you're talking about Helsingin Sanomat, and therefore no comment on that. But I have actually there's an intriguing example of these deepfakes with this Russian prankster duo, Vovan and Lexus, who have managed to prank several government officials in many European countries, and Bernie Sanders and Emmanuel Macron, and I forget, the list was very long. I think Prince Harry was on it too. So they have managed to, with the deep fake, get meetings, online meetings, with government ministers and foreign affairs committees of at least Latvia, Lithuania, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Poland. I don't think that we had a case in Finland as of yet, unless I've missed something. And they have faked to be sort of some person from, let's say, Russian opposition or Belarusian opposition or from the African Union. And they have, with these fake identities, requested meetings, and these have worked out perfectly. Not many governments have been able to actually notice that it was a prank call. And it's a really intriguing case because the connections between these pranksters with the Kremlin are not obvious, but nevertheless, this is actually quite dangerous because not only it makes the government officials make a fool of themselves, and that doesn't look great, but also they have gotten some information about Ukraine strategies and other things through these prank calls that have then gotten a lot of attention in the Russian media space. So this is one example.
Thank you, Minna. Someone would like to add something, or no? Maybe Roberta? Yeah.
As you can see, I like to speak a lot, and I have a lot of opinions, so of course I would like to add something. So there was a question earlier with win the war before the war. We can do that with education and critical thinking. So if we develop critical thinking in our young people, in ourselves, be responsible with that, we can win the war before the war, at least in the informational space. Second, with the contradiction between the institution, I'd say at least we have the freedom to do that and to correct that. And Romania is a very fresh democracy, I would say. We have only 35 years since we started to be a democracy. We still are not a perfect democracy, but we still feel very lucky to have the freedom to make mistakes and to correct them and not disappear like in Russia, like it happens today in Russia, and politicians that make slight mistakes that are not in agreement with the Kremlin. And last, about a very horrifying fake that went viral and actually affected the whole population, even my own pocket. So there was a story, an inflammatory story, that said that the price of the gas is going to double. So in the morning, the price of the gas in Romania was around €1, and in the afternoon, it turns to €2. And I really had an empty tank and had to pay €2 per liter. So yes, I paid double for a full tank again. But the line I had to be part of in order to put some gas in my tank was so large because not only it got inflamed and we had to pay more for gas, but the story was even more inflammatory, saying that it's going to be like 10 times the price. So one fake did the whole population in Romania stay in line to get cheaper gas. Can you imagine that? We are 20 million in the countries. Just picture that.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that we had a very fruitful discussion. From our discussion, I've retained some ideas. First, Maxime, the need to regulate what has become, or what you have described as a massive market to human attention. It's also very, we need to cultivate trust in our authorities to build resilience and to have maybe also a positive national narrative. I think it's a very, powerful idea. Before we stop, and I see, I think we need to stop. I had a last question, but I will stop here because it's time. So please join me to thank our very distinguished panelists and for this excellent discussion.